welcome back to the Mob Mentality Show. I'm Chris Lucian here with Austin Chadwick, and today we get to talk to Jay Bazuzi and Llewellyn Falco about mobbing on cloud-based infrastructure, really. And so maybe, I know that you've both been on the show before, but maybe you can each introduce yourselves a little bit, and then we can get into the topic. Maybe starting with you, Llewellyn.
Hi, I'm Llewellyn Falco. I'm an Agile technical coach, which means I go to companies and I sit with the programmers and we program together, learn to do it better. A lot of focus on software crafts, right? So refactoring, test-driven development, DevOps, that kind of stuff. And I was one of the people who sort of introduced Randori and Strong Style to Woody when it sort of became mob programming back in the day. Also wrote an open source project called Approval Tests, and do a lot of mobbing in my day-to-day work. I use it as a mechanism because it's so good at spreading knowledge.
All right, Jay, how are you doing?
Hey, hi, I'm Jay Bazuzi. I'm a software developer at a really big software company. I also do some technical coaching both at work and in the public. Llewellyn and I sometimes do some mob-based classes on the internet, yeah, that sort of thing.
All right. So, you guys are here to talk specifically about having a cloud machine essentially available for a remote set of mob programmers. So what does that look like?
So this whole thing started, almost a year ago, where Jay and I we'd get together on Saturdays and we just pair together. And pairing is easier, I think, than mobbing remotely, because you can kind of just, we were doing Zoom calls, we'd share a screen. It was just easier. And so we're working on a product called Pipelines, and we got into a point where it'd be really interesting to see how people use this, right? Like how they could use this API. And so Jay suggested, well, why don't we do a mob? Like, why don't we just open it up to the world and say, come join us and program together? And so we started talking about how are we going to do that? And Jay had recently been out to Hunter to actually mob. You want to tell about that?
Yeah, I'd been curious for a long time what it would be like to join these folks in a mob for a day, and making the trip seemed too difficult to make that happen. But then when we
all the way from Seattle,
right, yeah. I mean, it would have been, it's doable, but it's a big endeavor. And when we were suddenly all working from home, I thought this is a great opportunity. I can, just take the one day and we can all dial in together and do that. So that was the setup for that.
Jay mentioned that to us on one of our Saturdays, and I was like, oh shit, I could do that too. So I contacted and I got to spend a day with you. And one of the things that we took away from that was Anydesk. And Anydesk was just a really nice way of getting everyone on the same computer. And so I was like, oh, we can just install Anydesk on your computer, Jay, and we'll just bring these random people from the internet onto your computer.
Yeah. And I said, that's probably not going to work so well. As soon as you start giving remote control to people from the internet, there's always a chance that either a good actor will make a mistake or a bad actor will find their way in and do some damage. So we were looking for a different way to handle that.
And so we had used AWS before, so we were like, oh, we can put it up. And I had used AWS as a dev machine before. So they have Windows instances and you can spin them up, and Windows is a reasonable dev environment. So we went to, we just wanted to spin up an AWS and sort of install stuff on it, right? And I think you wrote a custom Chocolatey installer. You were probably the one who first mentioned Chocolatey.
Yeah, so Chocolatey, if you haven't seen it, is it's like a package manager similar to apt-get or Homebrew. And it doesn't come with Windows, but it's one line to install it. So that's pretty easy. And I said, hey, we can create this new VM in the cloud, run 2 lines of text on it, and get most of the stuff installed that we want. And that'll get us a good starting point. And that was the genesis of automating setting up these cloud machines. First, it was just 2 lines, and then we said, oh, it sure would be nice if this did a little more.
Yeah, so like Chocolatey just allows you to sort of say like C install IntelliJ or C install Java or C install .NET. Like it's just really easy to do it from the command line. And the moment that we started doing that, we're like, well, we should probably like make notes of what we're doing. And then Jay's like, well, let's do a PowerShell script. Jay is really good at PowerShell.
Yeah.
So I think you made like a GitHub gist or something, or like,
yeah, we started with a gist. It's relatively easy to, given the path to a gist, write one line of PowerShell that will run a script that's in a gist. So that gave us a place without having to deal with any kind of authentication or cloning. Is Git available? It's just one line of PowerShell to run a script that's in a gist, and then we could just keep updating the gist script every time we wanted to make it a little bit more powerful.
And that would happen a lot, because it's like every time we did it, we're like, oh, we forgot about this, or like it was like the level of annoyance would like get more refined, where it's like in the first we're like, no, we need something we can program on, and then we're like, oh, we also would like sounds, and it'd be really nice if it didn't annoy us with like the security questions, and like it just like every time anything that was still annoying us would rise to the top. And so like every time we did this, we would end up with like more robust scripts.
Mm-hmm.
And then one day we split out because we had duplication. Like this was working really well, where you could just spin up a machine. The nice thing about Amazon is like my bandwidth at the house is not always like Jay has fiber, lucky man. But some of us are not that lucky, and so like our bandwidth is not always that good. But Amazon's bandwidth is really good, right? And since everybody's going to Amazon, like if my bandwidth suffers, okay, maybe I get a little bit of latency, but the rest of the group is just absolutely fine. Like they don't have any problems.
Yeah.
And so this worked really well. It also works well if we're like doing a class in Europe. Like you can put the server over in Europe.
Yeah.
And so we started making more of these. And when we started making more of them, you just started ending up with these lots of gists that had a lot of duplication. And so we were like, how do we pull out a function, basically?
Yeah,
and Jay figured out how to do that too.
The story so far is kind of like you've developed out this initial infrastructure as code to allow for remote mobbing in a way that doesn't necessarily compromise your internal network security, right?
Doesn't touch our internal networks at all.
Yeah, that's fantastic. You know, kind of disposable machines. You can iterate quickly. You can change your infrastructure up in the cloud, and you get things like safety and reproducibility and things like that.
And you get safety in like weird ways. Like one is, like, those updates that you always have to install and pat, like we don't have those because these machines are never really more than like 2 weeks old.
Yeah, so
like, they're always on the latest version of everything.
Yeah.
And then we get security because what's the worst you can do on a machine I'm going to delete in an hour?
Yeah.
Like, yeah.
Now I'm interested in this duplicate code. I'm surprised this bothered you, Llewellyn, as a crafter. I mean, why does that matter? No, I'm just kidding. So what did you do with this duplicate gist code?
Well, so we had this ability to load a gist from a URL. So then when we load the gist and execute it from a URL, then we just load another gist. So we have one gist that called another gist, and then that just sort of cascaded a bit, right? So now we have like, eventually Jay was responsible enough to say like, we should put this in an actual, Git repository. So there's a GitHub like repository now, but it has like a base, like here's what you need to just have a Windows machine from scratch that is set up to mob. So like you need Chrome, you need Anydesk, you need the mob timer, like here's your basics, right? Then we have machines that layered on top of that for like, okay, well, here you want PHP and PHP Storm, or you want Java and IntelliJ, or you want Python and PyCharm, or you want .NET and Visual Studio. All right, and like whatever like your sort of dev stack is, like that's the next layer. And then there's a layer on top of that, which actually is the thing that you call and calls everything on down, which will say, this project. And Jay has a fairly strong, like every project should have a script that will take you from 0 to working. Like just you go here and you run the script and now you're in a fully working dev environment. And
totally agree.
Yeah, I want to talk about that a little. I had this experience over and over where I would come across some code in an open source project and I wanted to make it better in some way. I mean, I love refactoring, I love legacy code. And so it was really common that I would just see one line of code in a project. And I think there's another way to write that might be a little bit nicer. Why don't I just contribute this and move on? I'd clone the repo and I tried to build and I couldn't build it. It depended on something that wasn't installed, or the instructions were out of date, or I had a newer operating system than the one that the project maintainers were using, or whatever. And I thought, this is not only frustrating, but I'm in the worst position of anybody to solve this problem. Like, I have the problem, but I don't know how to solve it. And so the idea that I came up with from that was, you should be able to clone and then run an obvious script in the root of the repository without having to set up any prerequisites. And at the end of that script, tests are passing. It doesn't have to be fast. It doesn't have to be flexible. It's just about getting from 0 to running without having any existing knowledge or doing existing work. So that was some of the inspiration behind what we're talking about here today, but that's really a separate.
And also a lot of the philosophy, right? Like, we can go from 0 to a working machine in 20 minutes, which is a remarkably useful thing to have.
Yeah.
Like, I've had situations where we're mobbing remotely using another form of mobbing. And there's lots of problems like that occur with this, right? Like, so a popular one is Git handoff, where we rotate who's looking at the thing through Git. But the problem is, like, maybe you don't have the software installed, or maybe you have the software configured incorrectly, or even just the whiplash of, like, my windows are laid out here, and now 2 minutes later it's laid out over here, and which windows did you have open, and like it can be problematic. Where when you're looking at the same computer, you don't have that problem. We're looking at the same screen. It doesn't matter who's touching the keyboard. The environment isn't like just swap over changing. And being able to say, oh, this is a problem, I can have a machine ready for you almost instantaneously, and we can move to that, is really convenient. Right? And it can save a mobbing session that's going bad.
You can start the script and then it will run while everybody struggles. And then 20 minutes later, when no one's figured out anything, you can say, let's move over to my working machine.
Exactly.
It's kind of like, Jay, that concept is kind of like an automated README file, right? Like, I have this kind of belief that, all your documentation should be automated tests, like, that sort of thing, where it's like automatable and can run, and all your documentation just proves that it's actually true. This is kind of, very much along the same theme. And so, I see so many READMEs out there that are like, install this, install that, do this thing, do this trivial thing, or it's non-existent, like you say. And it would be just so nice to just step into a project and execute this little thing, deal with it and then move on, right?
And very often that's actually how we create it, right? So this is like a trick from Arlo, where he's like, just write down like a notepad of what are your steps, and then automate that by writing a program that says, do step 1, press any key to continue, right? And you have this like non-automated automated script, but now you have a space where you can convert it. So we would often make like these to-do lists, and like if it was something you could do a chocolatey, that install this just became C install this, right? And then we'd have things like fix the sound or figure out like do a reboot. And then it would go like a couple iterations before we figured out how to automate that. Like, some things are trickier to automate in PowerShell than you would expect, right? Like recently, one of the things we added is pinning the programs to the start bar, right? So it's like, it wasn't a big thing, but like we found a program that would do it for us, and then we added it. And now everything that we want, it shows up right where we want it based on whatever machine we start.
Yeah. That's cool. That's I think that's something we've seen multiple times with mobbing, is not scouting applies to refactoring, but also to automation, right? So every time you work through a checklist like that, you automate one more piece of it, or at least learn how to automate the next piece. Or as you and Jay were saying, you have an automation telling you to do the next manual thing, right? But as long as you're leaving the campsite better than when you found it, you'll keep landing in better and better places, which is super cool.
And you get to pay attention to like developer joy, which is something I think is often underrated, right? But like when we start doing it, we're like, hey, we have a machine that we can work on, right? But then very quickly that becomes like, and then you're like, and then you start to get annoyed. And whatever the thing is that's making you annoyed, whatever's making you frown, whatever's like, we can fix that. Like, so that's where we put our energy. And now we smile again. And then eventually like we'll start frowning again because we're fickle people and never satisfied.
There's always room for innovation, right?
Yeah.
One of the points of friction that showed up at one point, we were mobbing with a bunch of random folks from around the world, and one of them kept having a problem with latency in the shared screen in the Anydesk.
Well, so Robert is like out in the Netherlands, and he's on the other side of the world, so there's that, and something seems to like not be happy with his internet. So yeah,
gremlins.
So we would be working together, we'd be mobbing, and then somebody would ask a question and he'd say, I don't understand your question. What you're saying, what I see on the screen doesn't match what you're talking about. And we realized that his feed of the shared screen was getting delayed. He was getting behind what the rest of us were seeing. So we would really like to fix that, but we couldn't find a fix right away. So we added a step to the setup script that would change the Windows clock in the corner of the taskbar to include seconds. By default, it's just hours and minutes, but we found the config change to include seconds. And then we told him, just keep an eye on that. Whenever you think you might be out of date, check if that number matches your local time, even though we're in different time zones, right?
That doesn't matter, right? Because fortunately, internet time, like to the second, our clocks are okay. So you can be like, oh, mine says 10 and yours says 50. I'm 20 seconds behind.
Yeah.
Very interesting. Yeah. That's actually a very clever way to solve, or not solve it, but pay attention to the symptoms, right?
Yeah, make it easier to diagnose.
Yeah.
Cool. One thing that really jumps out to me from all of this is when you're in your little bubble and you're in your little world, you think like, oh, this is, the way to do it. Or if you're a little more reflective, like, oh, this is a way to do it. But the more and more I've learned about mob programming around the world, I should stop being surprised at all the different ways people have figured out how to do it, right? So there's, we've had Matt Killeran on the show before. He was the one who kind of led us to the Anydesk approach. But then before that, even before COVID, people were doing the Git handover.
Git handover works nicely on a team where it's expected that we all have a dev environment that's all set up and we all have access to the repo. Like there's an overhead.
Yeah.
Right. But it's much harder if you're just 8 random people on the internet who've never met before.
Yeah.
Now Git handoff has a tendency to be like the first session is either getting people's machines configured or leaving people behind. And neither of those are great situations.
Yeah, and definitely. And I think like any engineering, there's always trade-offs, right? But what I love is that there's so many different ways to experiment with it and find out what works. And like what you guys are sharing today has an excellent advantage of everyone having a setup machine to use within 20 minutes, right? And that's fantastic. Were you guys gonna show a little bit about how this worked? Would this be the right time?
Yeah. So you want to share your screen, Jay?
Right.
And for our listeners, we'll be very verbose if you don't have the visual.
So what we're looking at here is the Amazon EC2 Instance Manager Board. And this just sort of shows all the computers that are there. This page, by the way, is sometimes hard to find. So when you do find it, bookmark it is my suggestion. Like I end up going to this page all the time. And we're going to go over and we're going to start a new instance by just hitting the big orange launch instance button. It's going to come up and say, like, what kind of computer do you want? Do you want Mac? Do you want Linux? We don't want those things. We want just a simple Windows machine. We want the simplest Windows machine. So we're going to grab the 2019 base. No containers, nothing fancy, just the base. We're going to select that to start. And then it's going to come up and say, okay, well, that's the OS. What about the hardware underneath, right? And of course, it's virtual, but basically what we usually do is the TX large, right? A couple of things about that make that useful. One is it has 4 processors, 4 CPUs. So that's usually enough to sort of handle everything you're going to do. It has 16 gigabytes of memory. That's usually enough to, like, you're not choking on memory. And then it has moderate network performance, which on Amazon is gigabyte up and down, right? So their definition of moderate is slightly different than my definition, but it's a very good machine. And normally, if this was like almost any machine, I would just hit review and launch at this point. The exception would be if I'm doing something in Visual Studio, which is a little bit hungrier for disk space. So in that case, we're going to add some storage, and we're just going to change the default 30 gigabytes up to 100 gigabytes because disk space is cheap and we don't want to have to worry about it. And that's it. You just review and launch. And we've started a machine at this point. Like, now it's going to take about, oh, sorry. Jay is pointing out, I've missed a key part here. You will need a pair. You'll need a key pair to be able to get the password. So normally when we do this, I suggest create a new key pair. And there's a specific naming format that's a little bit helpful, right? So Amazon, because this is my Amazon key pair. Amazon key pairs are by region. So if you look, you'll notice that we're in the Oregon region right now. So I do an Amazon.Oregon to remind me, hey, this is the key, because it wouldn't show up, right? Like if I'm all of a sudden looking at something in Frankfurt or London, like I'd be like, where's my key? I need to remember that this is the key for this region. And then sometimes I find things on my computer that's like, oh man, back in 2012 I did, is this key still? So I usually put the year. So .2021, right? Just to like give me some clue of, is this the key I used recently, or is this a key from a long time ago? And that's it. So download the key pair, and this will allow us to get the password once it instantiates the machine. Yeah, so now we have to wait about 4 minutes, which of course is way too long on a podcast. So we're going to use the cooking show technique of, we already have an instance that is up. So let's go take a look at that instance. So again, we're going to navigate back to the instance's dashboard, right? And second for that to load. Here we go. The first thing is that machine that's popping up, it's good to give it a name. So you can click over where the name is and give it a name. This is helpful in 2 ways. One, it's just useful to remember what these machines are, because you're going to want to terminate and destroy them. And so some sort of label is useful. The other thing is when you download the remote desktop link, it will use that name in it. So let's call this, mob mentality dev.
Woo.
So again, like this is going to initialize, and that takes about like 3 to 4 minutes, but we're going to skip right through there and just open up one that's already been initialized for us. And so we're going to say connect. And then this is so weird. Like the RDP client is hidden away under a tab. So you have to click something to actually get to something useful. But then we just download this remote desktop file, and then we get the password. And these passwords they're not like real passwords. Like this machine isn't going to be in existence in a week. And then I turn it off when we're not using it for active development. Like it's not like a password that I normally care about. So we just sort of decrypt it and copy it. If I'm doing a lot of machines, I will come up with sort of a standard password that I just switch it as soon as I jump on the machine. So I don't have to track this all the time. And now we can open up the machine. We can remote desktop onto it. So let's do that. Put the password in. It's always going to come up and say this domain is untrusted, because it just throws it into like weird domains. You just click past that. And now we have a machine, and this is a server. So like it looks like a desktop, but it is configured like a server, meaning like really locked down. So it's super annoying even to right now opening Internet Explorer is annoying anyways, but this is going to be extra annoying. But we don't have to do any of that. Like we're just going to right click on the Windows thing and open up a PowerShell. And then we're going to go, back on our regular computer, we're going to go to the remote machine setup, or the machine setup from Jay's repo. And we're going to actually install the one for our course, right? So actually, so not even in the remote machine setup. Can we go to the our courseware? So if we go to Learn with Lou, refactoring to cleanercode.net, just like Jay said, like we have in the root directory, there's a machine setup. And if we click that PowerShell script, the very first line of it, oh, second line, says, the first line says to run the script directly. The second line actually gives you the line to run. So we just copy that line of code. And then we go back to the remote machine and we paste it in here. And you can see it just start going.
Oh,
right?
cool.
Yeah,
Nice.
and that's it. That's everything that's involved in getting a dev machine completely set up. Now, like I said, like this is going to take a while. So we're going to cooking show, jump ahead to what this machine looks like when this script finishes executing. And so here we are. We've got a mob timer set up. We got Visual Studio with InCrunch set up. We have our we have Git and GitHub set up. We actually have like 3 different flavors of Git that work well together, right? So we have the command line Git, we have the easy GUI Git, we have the Posh Git. We also have the repo has been cloned, right? So it always shows up in a standard location for us. We're ready to go. Like,
yeah, that's fantastic.
It's done.
Nice, nice. Wow. So basically you can like run the tests, everything's there, everything's good to go. So you guys use this for your class, you said? You have a
use it for the class, yeah.
So what's
there's actually,
go ahead, yeah.
One thing we'd like to demo, because we found that, you know, we've learned a lot about remote mobbing. It's an interesting thing to me. Like, I've done a lot of mobs in my lifetime, right? Like, so we were doing strong style Randori since 2009. Mm-hmm. I've probably done somewhere in the neighborhood of 1,500 mobs. It's a ridiculous amount. And I've never really done a remote mob with random people. And I know most of the people who do mobbing, and most people had not done remote mobs with random people, right? There's remote mobbings in teams, but just randomly grabbing a piece. So I don't think of, in particular, I think of teams that are mobbing as teams that are very open to trying new things. But apparently we needed a pandemic to get us to like try this one. So we've been learning a lot in the last year. And one of the things is when we would sit together around an actual computer, right? There was like, we usually would have the chairs sort of in a semicircle, right? The person who was at the keyboard was literally sitting at the keyboard. You could look and say, oh, that's the person typing. And if we were using like a designated navigator, they were usually standing. You could be like, oh, that's the person standing. And you could look at the person next to him and be like, that's the person who's going to be next. And that's like, I'm 3 people away. And you got all this for free. We didn't even consider it. We just totally took it for granted. Yeah. But then what we found is when you're doing things remote, that you didn't get that. And it became very confusing. And a lot of times people didn't realize they were up next. And so they would get a little bit blindsided. And so what we do now is we sort of do this call out exercise. And I want to go through that with you. This is exactly how we usually do it in any of our new mobs. So we're going to put the names in, right? So yeah, add Chris, add Austin. And then literally we practice it. So I would tell Jay, because Jay is first here. Actually, can you put up the list again? I'd say, Jay, you're going to say, I am Jay and I am typing.
I am Jay and I am typing.
And I would say, I am Llewellyn and I am talking. And Chris would say, I'm Chris and I am next.
All right, I'm Chris and I'm next.
And then when we rotate, I would say, I am Llewellyn and I am talking, or I'm typing.
And then
Chris?
I am Chris and I am talking.
Austin?
And then I am Austin and I am next.
And then we rotate again.
I am Chris and I am typing.
I am Austin and I am talking.
I'm Jay and I'm next.
And that's it. That's as simple as it gets. But doing that exercise makes a huge impact on the next hour that you spend working together. And we continue as we start the timer each time to call out who's typing, who's talking, who's next.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead, Chris. Yeah.
It's telegraphing intention, right? And so there's a lot of cool stuff around this. I was actually having a conversation around game development yesterday where characters in video games that express their intent through verbal communication appear smarter than actual AI smart characters that don't speak. And everybody, you know, who experiences a video game where characters telegraph their intent versus and have a dumb AI versus a smart AI that doesn't actually believe that the intelligence is much higher of the system that they're playing in. And I think that's interesting. It relates to this, I think, pretty significantly because you know, it allows everybody to hear over and over again the current state of the world, and so confusion kind of goes down to a minimum. And I think that in the video game example, confusion is you know, people are confused when something ends up behind you without making a sound, right? But they're not confused when things are just saying, hey, there's a guy over there, let's go search over this way. And so it's a fascinating thing, a very nice little correlation.
It also like fits really well with from the Turn the Ship Around book, this concept of talking out loud or thinking out loud, right? Or it's like, here we are, and we are thinking out loud. And that's like a core part of mob programming anyways, right? It's just, this was this part that we were taking for granted. Like, oh no, everybody's doing that thinking. And now we lost that when everyone's separated.
Yeah.
And now I'm going to be even more suspicious if you know, I'm usually never sure if it's a bot or if it's really Chris, but if whatever it is starts stating its intent, I'm going to be like, oh, this has to be a bot, you know?
Yeah.
Chris is working on programming himself so he doesn't have to show up anymore.
Oh man. And so that was a fantastic demo. Thank you so much for that. That was so cool to see everything up and running. Chris, this reminds me of one of my first weeks full-time mobbing. There was a lunchtime activity happening with EC2 instances, but this was in-person mobbing. But what I remember, it was a Unity mobbing thing, right?
Yeah.
And what I remember was, I was like, oh, you want to go to this workshop? I'm like, oh, sure. And then I'm sitting with like a DevOps engineer, and he's picking the most expensive EC2 instance and getting it up and running because we're about to run Unity with like 20 people on like 4 different machines. And so I think what was that one? That one was snapshots. Were those EC2 snapshots? Or?
AMIs, yeah.
AMIs.
So you can use AMIs to have a predefined machine as well, and that's another way of doing it. Also, like tools like Puppet and Chef are other ways of doing the infrastructure as code.
Okay,
absolutely.
So yeah, there's lots of ways to attack this. I think, you know, what you have with PowerShell and Gist is that you have a very, I think maybe more customizable or more easily customizable.
Very lightweight too.
Yeah.
Like it's lightweight. It's a text file in the root of your repo.
Yeah. But if you produce an AMI, then you can have this thing kind of ready to go. And so if you were maybe wanting to save on bandwidth in this example, like, so, you know, your script right now goes and downloads everything every time, right?
Yes.
If you compile an AMI, then you could save all that download time as long as your tools don't change. And so you can compile.
Right, but then you're like, which version of the tool am I on?
Yeah.
Right now, and one of the neat things is like we're doing the T2 because like we're just super cheap.
Yeah.
But we could do the most expensive machine when you're only using it for like a few hours.
Right.
We're talking about like maybe, you know, $150, right? Like it's not really expensive.
As long as you remember to turn
machines,
it off.
Yeah, you have to remember to turn it off. And we also terminate them a lot too. Like we will turn them off when we're not using them, and we terminate them when we're sort of done with the task. These are really disposable machines.
Yeah. Well, one thing you could do as like a natural evolution of this is use something like CloudFormer or Terraform to bring up the machine, and then also set a billing alert as well as an automatic takedown time. And so now you never have to remember to take it down anymore. So that's another option.
Yeah.
And to get into some futurism, I think we started talking about it once offline, Chris, was we had this vision of like, what if everything was cloud, right? And it's like you're in a mob of 6, let's say, and then there's a problem and you're like, I'd really like to replicate that problem and try and experiment with the mob, not trying. You can like spin it up and grab a pair and then go, you know what I mean? Like in that everything
Jay's
is
actually
cloud.
been doing that a lot.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, we put this together for our remote mobs, but I use this at work already. I use it with teams to set up training sessions, but also there are these times when I want to test what we're working on a clean machine or on a different environment. I work on the build quite a bit, and I want to make sure that the build works on a clean machine. So my machine's not a clean one, but I spin up a new one, run the build on it. I can do different operating systems or whatever. And then when I'm done, I just throw it away.
This concept of cattle, not pets to a dev machine has brought a lot of, there are different advantages than cattle, not pets in a production machine, but it's the same sort of magnitude of like, oh, there are all these really nice things I didn't realize that I didn't realize I was paying the cost of keeping these machines around.
At my previous job 10 years ago, right? When I first started that job, the amount of time it took for my dev machine to be ready was about 2 weeks, right? And so what we're effectively talking about right now is 2 weeks versus 20 minutes.
20
right?
minutes.
This is the philosophy of automation across the board, right? We're saving a chunk of time here, a chunk of time there, and then all of a sudden, things just go more and more smoothly. And especially if you're doing a lot of mobs with a lot of random people, this is a necessity, right? You don't want to have to do this every time, and you don't want to expose your computer out to the rest of the world. And it's great.
And you don't want to have to set up and explain how to set up to everyone you invite. Right? Like,
it's all in the script. You can see exactly what it's doing, and that's that can be all you have to say to them.
Well, and they don't have to do it. They
don't have to
here's the Anydesk ID, and now you have everything set up.
Morbid curiosity will take them down the path of the script reading.
Yeah, and it's funny. I ran into this problem this week. So we were mobbing, and there's different mobbing flows of mobbing. Sometimes you're kind of like in this tight TDD loop where you're doing custom behavior. We were in the like experimentation mode, like what will fix this API thing we don't understand, or what's causing this weird bug when you click on the screen and then spin a cat around and then something weird happens 10 minutes later, right? And so we were kind of in this experimentation mode, and I was like, I really want to run an experiment. I think I'm like 4th in the queue for running the experiment. And so I was like, I'm going to spin up another machine and try it. It's still participating in the mob, a driver, navigate when it's my time. And so I did. There was an extra physical machine for me to Anydesk into. And so I did that. But then I started running into issues like, oh, the database is out of sync, or, it doesn't have this or that. And so it took quite a while of turns to get it in a state where I could run the experiment.
Even usable.
Yeah.
I mean, I found that, right. So in my job as a coach, I split between a lot of different languages, right? And I found that like, rather than going to my own machine and having PHP set up and Python set up and C# set up and C++ set up and Java set up and Python, just rather than having all those things, like I have my Ruby machine and it's in the cloud and I just spin it up, and if I'm interested in doing something in Ruby, I do that. I have my PHP machine and I spin it up. And so I have a machine that doesn't have anything other than what is needed for that dev environment. And that has also been really nice because it's like you get weird interactions with this machine needs Java 8 and this machine needs Java 12 and this machine needs Java 15. And now they aren't happy playing together. And it's been really nice having just a machine per dev environment.
Yeah. That's super cool. Wow.
There's a couple other things we should mention in terms of remote mobbing that is maybe different, not necessarily related to machine setup, but one of the things Jay and I have discovered is the importance of breaks.
Sure.
Right. So actually in that timer that you have, it has a sort of hidden feature where you can put break, and it will do every time you make a full rotation, we take a break, right? And it sort of just handles that situation nicely. And so we're usually doing like a 4-minute rotation. So we're usually doing a 4-minute break. But when like when I would come to your physical offices, right, the rest of my life was outside of the building, right? So it didn't invade, right? But like even here on this call, like, you know, I know there are other people in the house, and I know there are things that might be needed for me, right? Like, and it just weighs on you. And even if there isn't, even if they have like, whatever, go do your own thing. Like, we're functioning adults, we don't need your help. It's nice to be able just to check in and be like, everything's still good, great. And then that buffer in the back of my mind can just clear, and I can go back, because there's this extra stress of your normal life is still at play while you're at working. Whereas an advantage to being at the office is that your normal life is literally like walled off from you. And so we have found that taking more regular breaks has been really important for remote mobbing in a way that it wasn't when we're just doing mobbing in a room.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. You know, it's not everyone had set out in the beginning of the pandemic to have a home office ready, and also, right, so you know, to the one person that has their laptop and they're sitting on their bed all day because they have nowhere else in the house to sit, you know, even just getting up for a little while is probably really important. And so yeah, I think I've made that observation as well. I think it's you know, when those breaks happen and people come back refreshed. I also, you know, there's also the other side of it, right, where people are not sitting in a 1 hour commute each way to get to the office, and so I think people are, you know, end up kind of being more refreshed, ready to go, kind of in the beginning. And so
I think that depends on whether or not you're mobbing or not. You might have a skewed perspective of this working at Hunter, but a lot of people who are not mobbing have found that even though they no longer have the commute, meetings has expanded to like just fill every available hour.
You know how I feel about meetings.
Yeah, I do know how you feel about me. Like, that's one of the things that like is often not talked about. Like, the power of mobbing is just how many meetings it reduces the need for and eliminates. But because of that, what happens is that, and I've seen this in people, especially when they're not mobbing, where they spend all of their day in meetings and they feel like they haven't done any work. Yeah. And I'm like, wait a second. Like, would you go to that meeting if the company wasn't paying you? Like that's how they're deciding to spend their budget of your time, right? But they're like, no, that's not actual work. I haven't done anything productive. And so they're actually working significantly longer hours and accomplishing less because of that. And so that's another nice thing about mobbing, right? Is on top of, you get actual interaction with people. Like, it doesn't feel nearly as lonely when you're actually mentally in the same space.
Yes. Yeah. And that's, I mean, that's the thing. So meetings for us, I think, are in the context of briefly interrupting the mob to find out, you know, what the next little turn in process needs to happen. And then it ends. And meetings typically end, you know, shorter than 15 minutes a lot of the time for ones that I've attended. And because it's like, okay, that's enough. But I think a lot of that just has to do with lean anyway. And I think that, you know, it's interesting because in remote mobbing, physical walking distance used to be a limiting factor because we had product owners walking between buildings, and they could only walk to so many places.
Now we teleport.
The buildings were spaced out. And so we actually see a lot more of our product owners for brief periods of time to do any course correction. And it's fantastic. And so, you know, I think everybody should really be lean about their meetings, right? And so, you know, it must produce value. It shouldn't be wasteful, right?
That's another interesting thing about the Amazon servers.
Yeah.
Right. Which is, so like we mentioned, Jay and I are teaching a class, right? And we have had, like I've been an instructor for decades now, and I've had all sorts of things go wrong in my classrooms. But one problem that I didn't have is I'd be in the middle of the class and then I would just disappear. Like, that was just that's not a problem in a physical classroom, but that is a very real possibility in a virtual world, right? Like, it was just, the instructor is gone. And now, because we're all on the cloud machine, a couple things occur. And one is like, if I'm gone, everyone else is still working together. I can actually like lose internet for a moment or reboot a server, and they might not even notice that I'm gone, right? Which is amazing. The other thing is things can fail in different ways, right? Like, so sometimes like, you know, my Anydesk connection will die, but the Zoom is still there. And so we can still talk, or sometimes the Zoom will die and my Anydesk is still there, and you'll see someone pop up like Notepad and be like, hey, like, help me out. Or we had a session where the person who was hosting Zoom couldn't show up that day. And so like everyone logged on to the Anydesk, and then they're like, okay, here's a new Zoom link. Like, this is where we'll do the thing, right? Yeah. And so there's this robustness that comes from that redundancy.
Yeah, oh, for sure. Yeah, I've definitely seen that a lot where, you know, whether it's, you know, the chat thread or, you know, or the Zoom or the video, the audio, or the Anydesk, there's always a way to communicate some way. Or the last result is always, hey, let me go text the person I was mobbing with and tell them everything has died for me and I'm coming back shortly. But well, a couple things I wanted to jump back into real quick was I wanted to give a resounding yes to the I have not experienced Zoom fatigue. So I remember, I think it was at a conference shortly after COVID, and it was a remote conference, and they did a fantastic job for the conference. But it was almost like everyone in the conference just assumed and was nodding their heads that was like, hey, we're all Zoom fatigued and working from home is a drain. Yeah. And I think for me, I was just kind of like, what are you talking about? But I think I'm in this weird remote mob programming bubble where you have breaks, you have social interaction, and it's not social interaction in a meeting where it's just listening to someone talk. It's like, you know, you're working together, you're getting things done. And so it's incredible how starkly different I think that experience is than from the kind of async work solo. And I was even talking with someone who has experienced mobbing and then has now in the async code review mode, and he just how much energy loss and how much emotional drain the stark difference.
Just straight out lonelier. I mean, like, I've been really fortunate that I've been like cultivating my virtual friends for like decades. So when the pandemic hit, I was like really prepared, right? But like, it has been significantly easier. Like, we're out here in New Mexico now, and like, we don't actually see people for months. But it doesn't feel lonely, right? Like, and it's because again, it's the shared mental space. And when you're mobbing and pairing, that mental space is really tight. It's very different than a meeting. Yeah.
I think the phrase from Simon, the people who wrote the remote mob programming org site is home, but never alone. And I love that phrase.
Yeah. I like that. Home, but never alone.
One other thing was, you both visited with us, and I want to test that the code you contributed and the ideas are still in there and bearing fruit. So thank you for that. And one thing I think I learned from that call out you did on the EC2 machine reminded me of it feels very similar to when you were on the show before, Llewellyn, and you had us do the physical rotate.
Yeah.
It's like the same practice, but the remote version.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It's surprising how practicing the small things really pays off.
Yeah. And I think, so I recently switched mobs, and I think those kind of practices are good as a reminder, because I think there's a whole different world when you're in the flash mob, so to speak, where there's people remote mobbing. And then there's the team mob where you might be on the same mob for a long time and there's this flow, or someone enters and there's a lot of assumptions people don't understand. And so I think knowing
anytime you join a new mob, it's a new mob. Like, adding one person or removing one person from a team, you now have a different team. And it's sometimes easy to forget that.
Yeah. And I think knowing when to pull out those tools and when not to is a good, I guess, wisdom or art of mobbing or switching and that kind of thing. And I'm still learning.
Hesitation is the trigger for me. So like, I was working with my team the other day, and I would notice when it's like, oh, I'm expecting someone, mobs are not quiet, right? Like, mobs are a very vocal activity. And I would notice like, oh, things are quiet, like we didn't call out rotation. And the moment you call out the rotation, the person's like, I am talking. And then they're like, oh, okay. And here's what I need to do, right? Like, it's just that intent, saying that intent sort of manifests itself. And so anytime that I see people sort of stumbling or hesitating, like, that's often a go one level up the chain of abstraction to intent, right? So it's, okay, I am talking. If then usually they know what to do. If they're still having trouble, you might need to jump down a level, right? Like, okay, what are you talking about? Oh, we're trying to do this feature. Okay, now they're starting talking. If they're still having problems, like, what's wrong with the feature? Well, the tests aren't working. Okay, well, now we know. Or they're still stuck, like, why aren't the tests working? Well, they don't compile. Okay, well, now we, like, you can sort of go up and down this level of abstraction to get to, okay, we're in agreement. Like, as you go up the level of abstraction, we get to agreement. And then usually they can go down the next level, but if they can't, then step down with them, and then they'll be able to go down the next level. And you get to the point where they can move.
Yep, for sure. Cool. Well, I think we are kind of coming up on time. So before we close, is there anything either of you would like to plug before we close out? So I'll start with you, Jay.
Well, I think that's something we want to talk about together. So Llewellyn and I are doing a free class about refactoring to cleaner code. And as sort of an adjunct to that, we are also available as code cleaners for hire. So if there are organizations that have some really gnarly code that you're finding difficult to work in and you would like a little help untangling that, you should get in contact with us. The way it works is we'll come in for a day, the two of us will work with one of your software developers, and we'll spend that day detangling that code. It is not a training activity. It's not about teaching how to do this. It's about getting that worst knot of code fixed up for you so that your organization can work better in that space.
And it's also not like, it's not a debugging thing. It's not like a firefighting fix. It's not a feature improvement. It is, we're going to leave you with functionally the same code, but code that is easy to understand, easy to extend, easy to test, code that's going to stop slowing you down. Yeah.
Nice. And I can attest, I think it was serendipitous the days both of you joined the mob I was in when you visited, was we were both in that point in time where it was like, okay, it works, but there's probably a better way to do this, probably a better way to write this. And so the stars just aligned in both those days. But so yeah, I can attest the code was much better. So I've seen it firsthand. They're not lying. So
we have a couple other things that might be interesting to viewers and listeners. One is if you want to see this in action, every other week, Jay and I do the Twitch mob, and it's, you can just jump on Twitch TV/Llewellyn Falco, and we do it every Saturday at 10 Pacific time, and for like 2 hours. And if you're not that interested in the code itself, you might want to join for like the last half hour, right? So just sort of jump like to 2 hours in where we're doing the retro, right? Mm-hmm. So we do a retro after each mob, and sometimes, like for a casual observer, that can be the more interesting thing, to be like, just to hear everybody talking about what they learned and observed from that hour. The other thing is, if you want to try this yourself, and you can't make the Cleaner Code class, there's also going to be a code retreat on March 13th from the Calgary Software Group, and they will have a ton of mobs there, and they'll be doing them in lots of different styles, but there will definitely be Anydesk on EC2 style mobs. And so you can jump in, and if you've never been to a code retreat, that's worth doing in and of itself. But you could also do it just because you're interested in, hey, let's see what it's like to mob with random strangers on the internet.
Fantastic.
All right,
cool.
Fantastic. We'll put links in the show notes for sure. And with that, especially if you're doing any remote mobbing and you're trying to get your environment worked out, then, and you know that somebody that could use this information, please share this episode with them. I think it's the best way to get some of these ideas in use. And with that, please like, subscribe, and we will see you all later. And thanks, Jay and Llewellyn, for joining us today. Bye, everybody.
Bye.